So as we've been talking about Chester, you've written a book called Paying for It about your experiences as a John.
You know, for several years, I saw a variety of women, sex workers. Some I would, if I liked them, I might see them multiple times, and others, if for whatever reason I didn't get along with that well, or I didn't find that attractive, then, you know, I would only see them once. And then in 2003, I met a sex worker, that liked her a lot. It's now 17 years later, I'm still paying her for sex.
So welcome to the Multiversity Project. Today we're joined by special guest star Chester Brown. Chester is a graphic novelist based out of Toronto who's written such works as a graphic biography of Louis Riel called Louis Riel, a comic strip biography, Paying for It, an account of Chester's life as a John, and Mary Wept Over the Feet of Jesus, a book about prostitution and obedience in the Bible. We'll be beginning by discussing the writing process, in particular of being a graphic novelist. We'll go on to discuss the role of prostitution in human society, both on a political and philosophical level. And then we'll go on to discuss Chester's political conversion to anarcho-capitalism. And we'll talk a little bit about the process of political conversions in general and of anarcho-capitalism in particular. Before we jump into the process of discussing the content of your work, we'd like to discuss the process of it a bit. So we were wondering, what's your writing process like? You mentioned you work a lot at home, but...
Yeah. These days, what I usually do, I start off writing a full script beforehand. I didn't always do that. My first book, Ed the Happy Clown, which I would not recommend your listeners go out and buy. It's, I think most writers are dismissive of their early works, and I'm the same way. But anyways, in that book, I just made it up as I went along, and it seemed to work out okay. At least a lot of people seem to like that book. But I tried that again with another work and titled Underwater, and that didn't go so well. So since then, I've written full scripts ahead of time. And these days, the script writing process, the way I do it is I take Post-it notes and I put like 6 Post-it notes on a page, and each Post-it note represents a panel, and in that panel I write the dialogue that would appear in that panel along with maybe a quick sketch if I feel it's needed, or maybe no drawing at all, just the words. It sort of depends. And then I work through the whole book, and then when I get to the end, I reread it and it's easy to make corrections. I just lift off if I think a Post-it note isn't working, I just lift it off, and if it needs to be replaced with another one, I put the new one in, or with a longer sequence. It's easy to move stuff around, is what I'm saying with the Post-it notes. So that's a really easy way for me to work as a graphic novelist.
Cool.
For the script, anyways.
Oh, cool. What's the name of the book that you're working on now?
I'd rather not say, but I will say another.
That's all right. You don't have to.
Yeah, it's another book of biblical. Another biblically themed work.
Oh, great! Yeah, I definitely enjoyed Mary Wept Over the Feet of Jesus.
Yeah, we both did. I will say, I've been a big fan of your work since 2011. So.
Oh, okay.
This is very
great.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah, Ariel introduced me to your work, so I've devoured it, and it's great.
Thank you.
Yeah. One thing I was wondering also is we were commenting while we were reading and rereading your work, a lot of your books are especially your autobiographical ones are super raw and full of some pretty intense self-disclosure. Does it ever make you uncomfortable to put kind of these intimate sides of yourself out in the world?
I don't think about it most of the time. You sort of just forget that people know this stuff about you, or you just maybe as a way of dealing with it, I just kind of pretend that people don't know that stuff. I don't know. I just don't think about it. Now I can, like for instance, with regard to the prostitution stuff, I can still get embarrassed about that stuff if it's brought up in the wrong way, in a way that I'm not comfortable with or whatever. Like I remember after I was coming to the end of that book and it was going to be coming out soon. I met up with some people I didn't know that well. Some of them I was meeting for the first time, and they, I talked about being a cartoonist and who did graphic novels. So they asked what I was working on. So I told them about, how I pay for sex, and I was doing this book about it. But as I was talking about it, I could feel my face getting red, and I realized I'm blushing.
Yeah.
So, in certain circumstances, like if I'm having to explain things like that, I can become self-conscious about this stuff. But yeah, most of the time I'm not.
Cool. Yeah, I guess just putting yourself out there in the world and being authentically you is, I guess, for all artists, that has to be worth it, despite the potential sort of embarrassment or vulnerability that puts you in.
Yeah, certainly with paying for it, I considered fictionalizing the events and, having a stand-in character who would not be called Chester Brown, who would be some other name, I don't know what. But it didn't seem like that was the right way to present the material. I wanted to get behind it, and it felt more honest to just, say, these are my experiences. This isn't some fictional character who went through this stuff.
Right.
Yeah, particularly since, I did want to say things from a political perspective. And yeah, if I couldn't admit that this is something I do, then, well, that seemed like it would be cowardly to me.
Yeah, and I do think that it was, at least from my perspective, it was more impactful to me that you're a real person and you actually had these experiences, versus reading, like as you said, some fictional story. Probably I consider the ideas in the book a bit more seriously because you did that, because you wrote it about you.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah, definitely agree that it landed powerfully in large part because it was autobiographical. So I think now would be a good segue into our main topic, which is a discussion of sex, love, and prostitution. So as we've been talking about, Chester, you've written a book called Paying for It about your experiences as a John. Would you like to give the audience some background on your story?
Okay. Well, the book starts in, what year would it have been? 1997 or 96, something like that. My girlfriend at the time broke up with me. It was kind of a complicated ending to the relationship, but basically she broke up with me. And so I was then faced with the decision of, where do I go now? Do I want to go into another relationship or not? And I had become sort of dissatisfied with the structure of romantic relationships. I realized I didn't like being in them, and I wanted to see what it would be like to not be in a romantic relationship. And for the most part, I liked it. I liked not having a girlfriend. But, I still wanted sex. So at a certain point, I decided to give paying for sex a try. And My first experience with a sex worker was very positive. I liked her a lot, and she seemed very nice, and so that sort of set me on that path, and for several years I saw a variety of women sex workers. Some I would, if I liked them, I might see them multiple times, and others, if for whatever reason I didn't get along with that well, or I didn't find that attractive, then I would only see them once. And then, I started paying for sex. I think it was in '98 or '99. I can't remember now, but anyway, in 2003, I met a sex worker. Had an appointment with a sex worker. Liked her a lot, and continued seeing her. And at a certain point, I realized I don't want to see other sex workers. I like this one a whole lot, and I just kept repeating with her. And it's now 17 years later. I'm still paying her for sex. So the book ends in, I guess, 2010. The book was published in 2011. So it ends with me, seeing that woman. In the book, I call her Denise. But yeah, that relationship has continued on since then, and I'm still seeing her now.
Wow. So so you guys do have some kind of and as you note in the book, she is not seeing other clients, and you're not paying other sex workers. So there is sort of an exclusivity to your relationship.
Yes, things have. At the time the book ended, we were pretty much monogamous. She was only having sex with me, and I was only having sex with her. Things got a little bit complicated. Have gotten a little bit complicated since then. For a while, I did get involved with another woman in a relationship that was not a sex worker relationship. It was just like a girlfriend, like a regular girlfriend. But I continued to see Denise, and I was upfront with both women, like the let's say the girlfriend. I won't use her name, but let's call her A. I was upfront with A. I'm paying this woman Denise for sex, and I'm not going to stop. So if you want to get involved with me, you have to accept that. And A was fine with that. And I told Denise, I'm interested in this other woman, and would like. Actually, before I started having sex with A, I basically asked Denise for permission. Like, is this okay? Like, with you? I felt like, I needed her go ahead. Basically, it was no longer, even though I was still and am still paying Denise for sex, it's not a regular sex worker client relationship. And so, yeah, I asked her for permission beforehand, and she reluctantly gave me permission. She was a bit angry, but yeah. So yeah, for a few months there, I was involved with both Denise and another woman, and of course that didn't last very long. A ended up getting jealous, which was sort of predictable, should have been predictable. She didn't think she would, but then she did, and it's understandable. So I had to make a decision between continuing the free sex relationship or the relationship with Denise, and I chose Denise. Although both women are, they're both wonderful, and it's too bad it couldn't work out the way with me continuing to be with both women. Although I'm still friends with A, like we still see each other regularly and talk on the phone a lot and that sort of thing. But yeah,
Oh, interesting.
as far as sex goes, since then it's just been me and Denise. And as far as her sex life goes, she probably wouldn't want me updating her situation since then. But let's just say that, she didn't necessarily stay monogamous with me.
Right. That's interesting. Okay, so I guess the question that springs up for me is, you make a case against romantic love in paying for it, and it sounds like in this sort of epilogue to that book that you had something resembling romantic love. So
Yeah,
how did you see that relationship? Did you see that as romantic love?
Yeah, I suppose. Although, I mean, my feelings for Denise are also sort of romantic.
Right.
What I wondered was, going into the relationship with A, I wondered if it would be okay, if it would work, if the relationship wasn't an exclusive relationship. If the reason why I hadn't enjoyed, my previous experiences with girlfriends had been because of the exclusive nature, and if that's what had felt confining about those relationships. Even before A started getting jealous, it's still, I don't know what it is, but yeah, I didn't like the feeling of the relationship, despite what a wonderful person A is. There's something about that structure, the structure of the romantic relationship, that just rubs me the wrong way.
Yeah, it does feel like kind of an imposition, or like there are a lot of expectations, extra expectations or something like that are placed on both partners in the relationship. So I've definitely had that feeling.
And somehow the relationship with Denise, even though it resembles in a lot of ways a romantic relationship, it feels different somehow. And I'm not quite sure how. And it's not like, I'm not saying it's a perfect relationship and everything is great between us. She frequently gets angry with me, and then I get angry back or whatever. Like, it's not like there's no conflict in it. We have to work through things just like romantic couples have to work through things.
Right.
But it somehow doesn't feel. I used the word confining earlier. I guess, or that's a word that seems to connect to how romantic relationships feel to me. The relationship with Denise doesn't feel like that. I guess I feel free in it, despite the fact that there's a lot of love in it. Certainly, I would use the word love in connection to how I feel about her. And she never uses the word love in relation to me, but she does. She uses the word friendship more in relation to how she feels about me, and she says that she has very strong positive feelings about me, but
Thank you. That's very interesting.
Yeah, it is. I'm curious. I don't think I totally understand your emotions around romantic relationships being confining. I know it seems like that's something that's kind of like tricky to articulate, but I do feel some curiosity around that.
Yeah, that's something I've always wrestled with, how to explain that. And I'm not sure. I'm certainly not saying that other people if other people don't feel that their romantic relationships are confining, that's fine. I certainly don't mean to say, people should experience them the way I do. And I can't say it's necessarily the arguments that go with them, because, as I just said, it's not like Denise and I never argue. It's something about maybe feeling owned, or that I'm responsible for someone else's happiness in a way I guess I don't feel I am with Denise. Maybe it's I don't know that I'm quite getting at it, and it's because it's vague in my own mind. Like, I know how I feel when I'm in those sorts of relationships, and I'm not saying, when I've been in romantic relationships, there have been lots of great stuff. There are wonderful moments being in. I have very fond memories of my girlfriends, and I'm good friends with some of them still, including A and the women who are in Paying for It. What I can't remember Sukian is the name that I used for one of them in Paying for It, and that's because her name really is Sukian.
Right.
That would be Sukian Lee, who I guess is well known for being a CBC radio host for many years. And then what was maybe I shouldn't, but there's another ex-girlfriend in Paying for It, like, I'm still good friends with her. I was just talking on the phone with her last night. So yeah, I mean, they were great women. I'm happy I had those relationships, but yeah, something about the setup of the relation of the girlfriend experience. It made me uneasy for some reason.
Yeah.
I'm feeling kind of curious whether with Denise, do you feel like a major part of the difference comes from the fact that, like, you're paying her and she's not your girlfriend, or more from, like, the fact that she doesn't appear to be in love with you?
Well, I had assumed that it was because I was paying for it, and that sets up some dynamic that must be different. But now that you put that idea in my head, that it's because she doesn't love me, that's like, that had never even occurred to me, and I guess I don't wonder about this as much as I should. That's an interesting idea. I'm probably going to be mulling that over after this interview is done. But not having thought about it, maybe that is true. Maybe it's because the emotions involved aren't as intense, and that makes it easier to deal with. It's possible.
Yeah, that's interesting. I can relate to your sort of feelings of discomfort in a committed monogamous relationship. It does. Ariel, I do think that you hit something there, where if somebody loves you a lot and you're in a committed monogamous relationship with them, you feel this. At least for me, like, I feel this sort of deep sense of responsibility that sometimes goes beyond that. It feels like bondage or something like that, where, as Chester was saying, you're sort of responsible for making the other person feel happy. And, if you don't live up to their, whatever image of you that they're in love with, then, somehow you've lost something beautiful or something like that. And so there's constantly this pressure to, like, perform,
Yeah, it's that was a big part of it, I think, is wanting the other person to be happy, and if they weren't happy, feeling it was my fault. Whereas with Denise, I mean, sometimes she's happy, but sometimes she's not happy. And when she's not happy, I don't feel like it's my fault the same way. Although I want her to be happy, and you know, if we're talking and she's not, you know, obviously I, you know, do my best to cheer her up or whatever. But yeah, it's not. It doesn't feel like it's my fault the same way, or that I'm somehow responsible.
Right.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I could see like the clear cutness of paying someone as maybe like simplifying like if you're not paying someone, it almost seems like it would be there's still something that people expect, or there's still something that must be like provided, but it's less clear. So I could see how that could be maybe anxiety inducing.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah, exactly. Like you're constantly wondering, like, oh, am I doing everything right? You know, is it my fault that she feels bad? That sort of thing.
Yeah, and another part of that is wondering about the future with a romantic relationship with girlfriends. There's the question of where is this relationship going? I think we're used to thinking of we're headed somewhere with this relationship. Are we going to have a child together? Are we going to live together? If we are living together, what's the next step? Are we getting married? All these sorts of questions, and those just aren't there with Denise at all. Like, you know, no, we're not having a kid together. We're not getting married. We're not going to live together. We know from the outset none of those are going to happen. We're not planning on them happening. It's not even a question, you know. So it's easier from that perspective too. There are no doubts about the future from that perspective. Although, I mean, I didn't, you know, when I started seeing her back in 2003, I had no idea that I'd still be seeing her now in 2020.
Right. Yeah. That's actually a pretty long relationship of any kind. So
yeah. No, I was just gonna say I can definitely relate to that point you're making. Like I feel like as I'm approaching 30, it's suddenly like everybody in the dating world is projecting into the future pretty intensely, and it makes it hard sometimes to just like get into a flow with someone as opposed to when I was in my like early 20s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and now with Denise, like we still don't talk about the future. Like there's no talk about where we're going with this. But I do find myself wondering how is there going to be another 17 years like this? Well, I know I'm still enormously happy. Like I'm happy about the state of our relationship and how it's going. So I guess it's a relationship that very much exists in the present. And I hope it just continues on like this.
Cool.
Yeah, I definitely can see that. Like it seems like for me in my experience, when I've just been able to experience the present with someone or like get in the moment, it creates a much more positive and free feeling dynamic than when it gets into a pattern of like discussing the future and trying to figure out if you're like the right person for someone for this long term kind of possible outcome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely a great point. That it's rare that I get into a relationship with somebody where they have exactly the same plans for the future of the relationship as I do. So
right.
This might be a good time to talk about like in Paying For It, you kind of depict yourself like going through this process with regards to like romantic love. Like early in the book, you become pretty disillusioned with it and you make some arguments throughout the book against it. But at the end, you seem to come to like a kind of different understanding. I was wondering if you could maybe talk about that process a bit.
Yeah. Like, as you say, at the beginning, back when I started paying for sex, I was very down on romantic love, and I could see all the problems with it, and a lot of people are miserable in their searches for romantic love, and they end up in these relationships that are bad for them, and sometimes even with partners who are physically violent or whatever, but they stay with them because they're desperate for love or whatever. So yeah, I was really I felt negatively about the whole thing, but at a certain point, and I guess perhaps it was partly because I was with Denise and I recognized that I was very happy with her and that my feelings about her were essentially romantic in nature, even if it wasn't really a romantic relationship. So I had to reevaluate how I felt about romantic love. And so in the book, I show myself deciding that what I'm against is not so much romantic love as it is committed monogamy. And so yeah, that's. And by the way, which did you guys read? Which edition did you guys read? The paperback one or the hardcover?
Hello. Yeah, I read it online. So I'm not sure.
Okay. Because there's in the paperback version, there's some additional material.
Okay, I definitely read one that had a lot of additional material at the end.
Okay. Well, yeah. There's in the paperback. There's a section. I'm flipping through it right now. There's a section. Okay, so there was the original edition, the hardcover, came out in 2011, and so for the paperback edition in 2013, I added even more notes. So there's this. So I don't know if you read that material. There's a section in there where I talk about I guess what my problems with I try and elaborate on my problems with romantic love, and I have a little extra comic strip with characters. One of them, I guess, both are monogamous, but one is jealous of in his relationship, and the other isn't jealous. And obviously, I think the guy who isn't jealous is the one who is the better partner, as opposed to the guy who is jealous. But I guess I also dealt with the question of jealousy in the original edition too. I mean, that comes up early in the book because when I was with Sukin and she broke up with me and started, seeing other guys, I realized I wasn't jealous, and that helped at that point.
Gotcha.
But yeah, jealousy is one of the big problems with romantic relationships.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I read the edition with the two characters, the jealous one and the not jealous one. That seems familiar. I feel like I read some text about that. I'm not sure if there were panels like drawn panels about that. So I mean, I guess this just goes down to the root of the issue, which is is like, why does jealousy exist? Is it something that is sort of an evolutionary advantage? Like why do we have it? And is it something that used to be an advantage, but now it's not? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I tend to see it just from the perspective of maturity. It's and I'm saying that as someone, I definitely in my with previous girlfriends, I had overwhelming jealousy at certain points with certain girlfriends. so I was capable of feeling jealous, and it was horrible, and it was not a good thing in those relationships. And so when Sukyin broke up with me and started, seeing someone else, and I didn't feel jealous, that felt like a very positive thing. And I guess I assumed it was because I had matured out of that jealous phase of my life. And I mean, it's the same thing with Denise. She's obviously, when I began seeing her, when she was working as an escort, she had lots of sexual partners, and she had a boyfriend too. And despite that, I had no jealous feelings. Like I was fine with that. I get so yeah. To me, it's more a matter of maturity. I'm not sure about evolution.
Well, I was going to say, I guess, would you say that jealousy is always something negative, or can jealousy have positive outcomes or positive? Yeah. Can it improve things? Can it cause things to come out better, or is it something that should always be avoided, basically?
I don't want to say what other people should feel, but I know I'm happier that it's not in my life. I like not being jealous much more than I liked myself when I was a jealous person. So I think it benefits the individual, but I can probably imagine ways that it could be good for couples if they are able to talk things through and whatever. But yeah, I would think in general it's probably negative for most people.
Gotcha.
In most situations, for most couples.
I'm curious. Do you how you view romantic love now? Like how you define it, and whether that would be necessarily something negative or toxic?
The way I see it is, I don't think there's anything wrong with one person feeling romantic love for another person. I think the bad part of it is having expectations of another person, wanting, like if you're involved with someone, wanting them to act a certain way. And let's say it's getting married. If you're getting married to a person and you're totally fine with making a vow of celibacy forever with that person, I guess I have no problem with that. But expecting the other person to make that vow and wanting to hold them to it for the rest of their life, that feels like a confining thing. That feels like, yeah, it's a control thing. You should be happy if they want to be with you, and if they fall in love with someone else, you should be happy about that too. Rather than getting jealous about it or thinking that's a bad thing. So I guess what I'm saying is, I think it's good if you love other people, but you shouldn't expect other people to. You should be happy when they reciprocate that love, and if they do for a long time and then they stop, well, then just deal with it.
Yeah,
right. Okay.
This definitely reminds me of our relationship anarchy discussion. It's a tough issue for sure. Like I agree to a large extent that it's definitely not a healthy thing to expect other people to love you or to remain in love with you or to even really act in particular ways, I guess, over the long term. I mean, it does seem like relationships must conclude some degree of expectation and reciprocation. Like even with you and Denise, like there's an exchange taking place, and I imagine there's like expectations around that exchange being fulfilled.
Yes. If I'm sure our relationship could end if or if one of us became unhappy being with the other, like we both have to be happy in the relationship or getting what we want out of it for it to continue. It might end at some point. She might grow either unhappy with me, or, I mean, I've been wondering why this hasn't happened for several years. Why hasn't she fallen in love with some guy and wanted to run off with him and be exclusive with him? For whatever reason, that hasn't happened. But I hope I would be happy for her if that did happen. I want her to be like. I know that she is not sexually fulfilled in our relationship the way that one really, in the best case scenario in a sexual relationship, the way they should be. I do my best to give her physical pleasure, but yeah, she would not choose me as a sexual partner if there wasn't a financial component to this relationship. And if she did start a relationship with someone else who was sexually fulfilling her, like, I would be happy about that. And if she then, as a result, ended our relationship, I hope I would be able to handle that and as I said, just, be happy for her. So far, for whatever reason, that hasn't happened. I don't know why it hasn't happened. She's a wonderful person and beautiful. Like, she should be able to find some guy who, but again, I shouldn't talk about what she wants or what she doesn't want. For whatever reason, things have gone the way they've gone, and I'm still happy the way things are with her now. So yeah.
I was going to say, well, I'm definitely happy for both of you that you've been able to make this unconventional relationship work as long as it has, and I hope it continues, like you said.
Yeah, I guess something I'm just wondering, like, listening to you talk, like is it hurtful that, like, she doesn't really, like, feel fulfilled by you sexually, or, like, doesn't appear to be in love with you? Like I know for me, it would be very painful for me. I would really struggle to be in a relationship with someone who didn't reciprocate my feelings or have some kind of desire for me. Maybe it's a gender thing, but I don't know. What do you think, Chester?
I'm not sure it's a gender thing, because I think a lot of guys would feel the way you think you would feel. But yeah, I don't feel hurt by it, and it's not like I don't get anything emotionally from her. I mean, she says and she expresses a lot of emotional warmth for me. Like, she is loving and says loving things in every way except using the word love. And when she says nice things about me, I believe them. I believe she's being sincere. So I do get a lot of I do experience a lot of positive emotion from her. As far as the sexual stuff goes, I just feel badly for her. Like, I wish I was in, her ideal of what a man should be, or whatever, that I was completely fulfilling her. But it's not, I don't feel hurt about it. It's the way it is. I mean, when you pay for sex, if you're realistic about it, you just sort of accept that that's the situation, that you're having sex with women who aren't having sex with you because for reasons of sexual fulfillment. Like, that is not their goal. Like, they usually do have partners in their life, or they often do, who do fulfill that role. But yeah, they're having sex with their clients for different reasons. Well, obviously financial reasons. So yeah, you just when I went into the relationship with Denise, I went in with my eyes open. That like, I knew that was the case. And it's not like, I mean, relatively early on, at some point in the first few years that we were together, she did insist that she did enjoy having sex with me. Now, that was many years ago. She has not repeated that since. At some point, I did ask, "Have you ever had an orgasm with me?" And she was honest. She was like, "No, never." And that's one of the great things about her, is she is totally honest with me. Like, she says things like, most sex workers, well, I shouldn't say most, a lot of sex workers would have lied at that point and said, oh yeah, I've had orgasms with you. But no, she was like, no, I never have. But for whatever reason, I don't experience that as hurtful. Like, it's the way things are. And I find the relationship with her so fulfilling in so many ways that focusing on that would seem like, why would I focus on the negative?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. There's almost like something stoic about what you're saying, kind of like we talk about stoicism sometimes. Are you familiar with that? Yeah.
I think, I heard your Stoa episode about Stoa, or at least one of the episodes you did about Stoicism too. I have an interest in Stoicism. Not that I'm any sort of expert on it, but yeah.
Right. I mean, the way that you describe your love for Denise, it sounds very sort of pure and giving. Like, you want the best for her, and you'd like to be able to, be everything to her if you could, but you're totally okay just having the relationship that you have. And so that, yeah, there's something that's simple and pure about that, I guess.
Well, it's a matter of recognizing, and maybe that's another thing about romantic relationships, is that you feel like the relationship has to be perfect, and you're trying to be the best romantic partner possible. Whereas in this relationship, I knew from the beginning that it had limitations and that it couldn't be everything. She couldn't be everything for me, and I couldn't be everything for her. The setup is, it's sex for money, and if you get more out of it than that, and I think we both are getting more out of it than that, then that's a bonus. And there's a lot of bonuses in this relationship. I'm definitely getting more than just a sexual relationship with her, or a series of sexual experiences with her. It feels like much more than that.
I'm wondering, like, do you desire for her to have like stronger feelings for you? Like, if she was like, Chester, I love you, like went to that level, would you be happy, or would it be like neutral?
Boy, I do get this question often. Like, if she said, I love you, and let's turn this into a conventional romantic relationship and cut out the money part. And she wouldn't do that. But if she did, I think I would feel nervous, like, it's becoming just a regular romantic relationship. It's probably going to end soon. But I will admit that I have, in my fantasies, she says stuff like that, or she wants, she falls in love with me or whatever. But those are fantasies. What one fantasizes over is not necessarily what one wants to happen in real life.
Right.
yeah, I think realistically, I'm happy with how things are, and realistically, I don't think I want more than this.
Gotcha.
Interesting. And you don't feel like there's like, maybe this is a little bit an unnuanced question, but do you feel like there's anything missing in your life or in your experience, or it sounds like you're pretty content?
Yeah, I'm pretty content. I don't think I would change anything about her. Like, she's a wonderful person. She's the personality she has is that's like, I wouldn't have known it, but it's apparently the personality I want, and I still find her enormously sexually desirable, probably as sexually desirable, if not more sexually desirable, as I found her 17 years ago. It doesn't feel like anything is really that. No, I don't think anything's missing.
Cool.
Yeah. Well, this has been really interesting. Thank you for being so forthcoming, Chester.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah. So, Chester, to start off, do you want to maybe just give us like your big picture perspective of like how you view prostitution?
Yeah, I think it's good for society. That it's beneficial for, which doesn't mean that every sex worker experiences it as being beneficial, or every client. I mean, there are definitely sex workers in bad situations, and situations that I would hope they would be able to get out of, and of course there are clients who don't like being clients or whatever. But generally, I think sex work is good for society, benefits for the most part the people in it, and that it should be decriminalized. It should be seen basically as the same as dating. It's just a form of dating, and there should be no more regulations put on it than there are regulations put on dating. Basically, the same sorts of rules should apply. You shouldn't commit assault against someone you're dating, and whatever. And whatever, you shouldn't do it with children. Whatever. So. Yeah, but so I'm obviously against the laws that we have here in Canada at this point. The laws changed since paying for it came out. When most of the experiences, or I guess all of the experiences in paying for it that I show, since it took place before 2014, which is when the laws changed. Up to that point, it was illegal. In most circumstances, it was illegal to pay for sex, and it was illegal to accept money for sex. Although it was legal, it was okay if the sex worker came to the client's place. That was legal. But if the client went to the sex worker's place of business or residence or whatever, then that was illegal. And also, it was illegal to communicate for the purposes of prostitution on the street. So, being a streetwalker was illegal. And then the Supreme Court of Canada struck down those laws in 2013, and So the conservative government brought in new laws in 2014, which basically made it illegal to pay for sex in any circumstance, but strangely enough, legal to accept money for sex. So it is illegal for me to give Denise money, but it is legal for her to take it from me and to, I guess, well, I'm not sure. Well, it is illegal for me to give her money and then have sex with her, but she's not doing anything wrong in that circumstance. So, yeah, I think I'm against that law, just as I was against the previous laws. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely a good jumping off point. I think that most recent system that you mentioned sounds like the Swedish model or the Scandinavian model.
Nordic
That's what
model,
it's
yeah.
called.
Yeah, the Nordic model.
Model. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm curious, Chester, how do you view prostitution as being good for society?
I think it benefits, for the most part, usually. It benefits both parties in the exchange. The client finds himself sexually satisfied, usually, and the sex worker gets the money that she wants. So yeah, it benefits both parties, and it just generally adds to the sexual satisfaction in society. It makes for a more generally sexually satisfied population.
Yeah, this might be the part of the conversation where I need to start pushing back a bit against some of the things you're saying. From what I've seen in prostitution, it seems to me that a lot of the men are maybe getting sexual satisfaction, but women I've known in prostitution definitely are not. And it does seem like it even causes psychological and emotional damage where it's hard for them to get sexual satisfaction at all.
I would agree that in the exchange, yes, it is the client who's getting sexual satisfaction, not the sex worker. I don't think that means necessarily the sex worker is not having sexually satisfying experiences, but she's not having them with her clients. They often do have boyfriends or romantic partners or other ways of other sorts of sexual partners who they do have, hopefully, sexually satisfying sex with. As far as, you say you know some sex workers or ex-sex workers who you think have been emotionally damaged by it?
Yeah, it's not an uncommon thing to hear that when someone has been working in this industry or like doing this for a while, it makes it hard for them to either do certain sex acts or to even have sex at all, or sometimes to be in romantic relationships. Like it causes sexual issues or exacerbates them, maybe exacerbates pre-existing ones.
Yeah, I can see that it might. I'm not sure that that's because of sex work itself, and that might have more to do with the stigma around sex work. My comparison would be to the way that gay people, gay men, or lesbians too, I suppose, felt prior to, say, the 1970s. A lot of them were enormously conflicted and about being gay, and were tortured about it. It was horrible for gay people when almost all of society was against you and saw it as a mental illness. And a lot of them did experience being gay as a mental illness. But that had nothing to do, obviously being gay is not a mental illness. They experienced it that way because of the way that society stigmatized them. The American Psychiatric Association, I think they only declared that it wasn't a mental illness sometime in the early 1970s. And so my question would be, why are if and I don't dispute that there are sex workers or ex-sex workers who feel conflicted and perhaps are feeling emotionally damaged, but it's why, like, what is causing that?
Yeah, I mean, it can be hard to distinguish those factors for sure. I will say that I identify as gay, and I don't see them. I see a lot of pretty big differences between the two. I mean, one thing that I did want to talk about with you is I am very concerned about the number of women who go into sex work, or the proportion who either have experienced child sexual abuse or who have some kind of problem with drugs. And then you look at it at the end, it seems like I just pulled up a study, like there's studies that women who go through this profession end up with, like I said before, like some high incidence of mental health problems and often physical health problems. It doesn't seem to me that that's, I mean, maybe it's all stigma, but like that kind of thing concerns me. Like when I see something that, like, there's been studies that the overwhelming majority of studies on this topic show that most women who go into prostitution have some kind of child sexual abuse. Like, that doesn't seem to me like it's a form of dating like any other, or that it's an innocent act of commerce. Like that concerns me.
Well, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, there are always problems with statistics. I would be skeptical about whether it's true that the majority of sex workers actually had sexual abuse in childhood. Certainly, Denise tells me she didn't. But of course, that's one anecdotal case. But I also think it's a problem when you say that you're not allowed to do something, or you can't do something because of something that happened to you in childhood. You know, we should make, and maybe you're not saying this, but we should make sex work illegal because of the experiences that many of its practitioners had in childhood. It could be that this is the way that going into sex work is a form of healing for them. Certainly, there are. It's healing for their clients, or it's healing for a lot of their clients. And I've heard a lot of interviews with various sex workers and read works by various sex workers who said that it was, and I'm not sure I've read any that said it was healing, but they've certainly read the word or the phrase self-empowerment in relation to it, and feeling powerful and feeling in control and enjoying that, and quite frankly, liking the money that came along with it. I mean, there are sex workers who don't like the work, and there are sex workers who do like it. And I don't think. I think it should be left to the individual. If there's a sex worker who doesn't like the work, yeah, she shouldn't be doing it. She should be, and I realize it's difficult because it is so lucrative that they can feel trapped in it because there isn't another. They don't have an option of another sort of job or another form of work that is that makes as much money for them. So that is something that can happen. But I don't know that there's a way around that. Certainly making it illegal because there are certain sex workers who feel trapped in it, when there are other sex workers who like the work and would be like, how is it fair that they can't do it because there are other sex workers who don't like the work?
Yeah. I'm going to make some distinctions here.
Okay.
So it seems like there's one argument that's sort of like, is it good for society or not?
Mm-hmm.
There's another argument that's like, kind of like from first principles, should we restrict people's behavior in this way?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a question of legality, like how can we like incorporate all that into deciding what laws we should make?
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel like maybe might try to tackle them one at a time. Like maybe we can try to see if we can get some kind of handle on this question of is it good for society or not?
Well, I was just going to point out that I think those questions are related because I think anything can be good or bad to society depending on how it's implemented legally. So I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I know a lot of people who are pro-legalization will argue that the negative effects to society are largely stemming from the stigma and the criminalization.
Right. Yeah. You're giving people more options is better than narrowing their options. Giving potential sex workers the option of sex work, of making a lot of money, is better than saying, here's your minimum wage job or here's your welfare, which is more or less the same as the amount that you would get in a minimum wage job. I just don't see it as benefiting people to take away that choice.
I don't know.
It's better if you have that choice, and especially since there are women who do end up liking the work, or yeah.
I mean, choice is always determined by context. I mean, would you say as like a general rule that it's always good to allow people to make any free choice? Like, would you say that like, what if someone wants to sell themselves into slavery? Like, what if I was like Chris was like, Ariel, I'll give you $100,000 for 2 years, and in 2 years you got to be my slave, and you can sign this contract. Like, should I be allowed to sign that contract?
I don't like the sounds of that contract. A contract for 2 years. Well, maybe for 2 years. I certainly would balk at the idea of a lifetime slavery contract. But I mean, it's not like sex work is even like that. It's you can try it one night, and if you hate it, it's like you don't have to ever do it again. It's not a 2-year thing or a lifetime thing necessarily.
Well, we'll be touching on the topic of trafficking later, but I guess it's for me, like looking at these situations where I'm seeing these women coming from situations of like child sexual abuse, where we know there's a lot of evidence that like child sexual abuse can lead to patterns where like over sexualization and like sexual seeking and stuff like that. Like they lead to a lot of behavior patterns that seem to parallel prostitution. And then they're going through prostitution, and a lot of them are coming out with psychological damage. It does seem to me that that's a trajectory that, I guess it depends how much we think we should be allowing people to do things that are harmful to themselves or could be harmful to themselves.
Yeah. I mean, to me, the question is, what do we do about that? Even acknowledging, and I don't acknowledge it, but even if we say that sex work can be psychologically damaging for some people, and you know, I obviously I think it's because of the stigma, and you think it's for other reasons, and maybe it is. But what do we do about it then? So if the answer is we therefore make it illegal, it just doesn't seem fair for the people who feel they're benefited, for the sex workers who feel they're benefited by it, who feel who like the work, who feel that it's benefiting them.
Well, and I think maybe it's also important to point out that studies that show correlation between child abuse and sex work, or studies that show correlation between sex work and psychological damage, are showing exactly that. They're showing a correlation, right? Not necessarily a causation.
And also, I mean, the subject is such a contentious one. I don't believe all of the statistics about it. Certain researchers have been shown to be producing research that statistics that just aren't true. The case that ended up before the Canadian Supreme Court in 2011. Before that, it was being argued at the provincial level, and I'm trying to remember the name of the judge, Susan something. I can't remember her last name, but anyways. She cited the research of Melissa Farley, who is one of the foremost, supposed experts on sex work, and she has a bias against sex work. And the judge pointed at Farley's work and said, "No, this research seems tainted to me. It's not." I can't remember. I'm paraphrasing, but she did say it didn't seem like reputable work, and she's one of the ones who's cited all the time by people who oppose sex work. So, I mean, is it true that there is that much childhood sexual abuse? I wouldn't say there is none. That there are sex workers that there's a high number of sex workers who experience childhood sexual abuse. I'm sure there are some, but how large that number is, I'm not sure I believe the stats on that. But hey, it's debatable. But a lot of that research, you can't rely on it because it's such an emotionally fraught subject. People can't be objective about it.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely problems of tainted research especially on political charged issues on all sides. We'll link the studies in the description, and people can decide how credible they find it. To the point of stigma, I do want to point out that, like, reading about a lot of these countries where prostitution has been legalized versus the Nordic model, it does seem like there's evidence that the Nordic model, that under the Nordic model, the conditions are better. And a lot of these countries that have legalized, like Germany and Amsterdam, the conditions seem pretty atrocious to me. Like, certainly there's a lot more murders in those countries. Like, there haven't been any murders of prostitutes under the Nordic model in Sweden since those laws were implemented.
That's not true. That's not true.
In Sweden specifically. Maybe my stat there is out of date.
No. I can think of one, and now of course one is a low number, but there's been at least one murder. This woman named Jasmine something or other. I certainly sex worker rights advocates were making a big deal over the murder of this woman. So, but yeah, defending Amsterdam and Germany. I mean, those aren't the models I would advocate for. That's not decriminalization. That's legalization. And as sex worker rights advocate Maggie McNeil says, legalization is just another form of criminalization. You're making you're allowing certain sex workers to work while you're keeping others in the black market and making it illegal for them to work. So yeah, I'm not a fan of what's going on in those countries. The country that sex worker rights advocates always point to as being the best currently is New Zealand, and it's closer to the decriminalization model there. And from what I hear, things are going well in New Zealand for sex work. And it's violence rates are low and all that sort of stuff.
I just wanted to point out that the anecdote that you brought up about the woman in Sweden who was murdered, her name was Petite Jasmine, and she was murdered by her former partner with who she had a couple of kids. So it doesn't seem like it was a client of hers that murdered her.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm trying to. I'm trying to remember the story better because sex worker rights advocates were saying that if the Swedish model wasn't in place, she would have had more options. She felt. I can't remember the story exactly, but they were blaming the law in some way. But yeah, since I can't remember the details, anyways.
No, that's okay. I mean, I know like a lot of the criticism of the Swedish model is the idea that sex workers can't really access the police, and it seems like a lot of the time, like landlords are motivated to evict them because they don't want to be there's a potential liability.
Yeah, the story is I mean, so I have this article that has the story in it. It's called "Should Buying Sex Be Illegal?" It just says basically women who work as prostitutes in Sweden have such a large social stigma against them, and that's what the criticism of the law is, that it creates this huge social stigma against women who do sex work. And so basically the story is that she had lost custody of her children, and her husband had a history of violence, or her partner. I'm not sure if they were married, but anyway, yeah. So she was basically fighting to get her kids back, and he killed her. So yeah, the article that I'm reading blames the social stigma that was caused by the Swedish laws.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really tragic case. And it's hard because like, I want to say now, like, well, maybe the Swedish model should exist without stigma, or maybe like it shouldn't affect custody. But I recognize that like having those laws in place seems like does create a stigma.
Mm-hmm.
But I still will point out that like there's maybe like been one murder. Like the articles I was reading from 2016 were saying like no murders since the Nordic model was implemented in Sweden, compared to Germany, where you've seen 80 murders in the same time period. I mean, Germany has like 8 times the population, but still, it leads me to think that maybe, like it almost feels like it's a little bit like floating signifiers. Like in Germany, it's been highly destigmatized, but there's still a lot of problems. And I know you're saying maybe it's because it's so regulated by the government, but it doesn't seem like the destigmatization has improved things.
Well, I don't know, but the situation in Germany, I don't know that it is so destigmatized there. And maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But anyway, Ariel, if you're advocating for the Swedish model, do you think I should be in jail?
I'm not necessarily advocating for the Swedish model. Like it seems to me that, I mean, we can talk about the Swedish model in a moment. I see a lot of benefit of a model that's similar to what Germany had before, I believe it was 2001 when it legalized, where the pimps are criminalized. And so like it seems to me that there's an argument that like a lot of the women are like doing it entrepreneurially and there's no pimp involved and it's an empowered thing. And it seems to me that a big division between a lot of the exploitative cases and the empowered cases are the presence of a pimp, and that in a lot of places where it's been legalized, you see a lot of abuse happening through the structure of the brothel and the pimp. And I think you'd probably agree, like a lot of criticism of like Amsterdam is that like they're basically legalizing brothels, but not legalizing prostitutes to the same extent. So it's like totally giving the power to the pimp. So what do you think about that model, Chester, where we see like, you know, pimping's not allowed, but you know, you and Denise, a kind of relationship like that, it's fine. No pimp involved.
Well, the difficulty with making pimps illegal is that it's difficult to distinguish between an abusive pimp and a regular boyfriend. And if you, I mean, that was one of the reasons why that law was struck down in Canada. I mean, we had a law against pimps in Canada, and that was struck down in the federal level in 2013. That law was struck down was because sex workers were saying, you know, my boyfriend is being arrested. He wasn't a pimp. Like he's my boyfriend. So it was essentially making it illegal for sex workers to have romantic partners. And that's the thing, is like, from the outside, how do you tell the difference? Which isn't to say there aren't abusive pimps. There are. They're horrible. Yeah, there just isn't a way of distinguishing. If you say you're not allowed to live off of the avails of a sex worker, I mean, how is that fair? Because I've had female friends who are not sex workers who, for periods of time, have supported romantic partners or boyfriends, husbands, because for whatever reason, the boyfriend or husband needs support. Maybe he's going to school, or maybe he's lost his job, and whatever. For a certain period of time, he needs the financial help. And so saying it's okay for non-sex workers to support their romantic partners, but not for sex workers to do so, because that looks too much like pimp, like that partner is a. It's the problem. It's the problem that we have with any sort of abusive relationship. How do we get women out of abusive relationships? Because that's what a pimp is. A pimp is an abusive boyfriend or husband. How do you get women, whether they're sex workers or not, out of these relationships? Because they're usually in the relationships because they feel like they love this partner, even if he is a horrible person.
So are you just to clarify, are you saying that if you make pimping illegal, then the problem is that then boyfriends of sex workers become basically criminals, regardless of whether they even know about the sex work taking place?
I suppose that's, yeah. I was assuming that the partner would know that their girlfriend or wife is a sex worker. So say the boyfriend knows that their girlfriend is a sex worker and is out of a job or something like that, and the girlfriend is supporting the boyfriend through sex work, but he's not forcing her to do this. She's just doing it because she loves him and she's nice or something like that. I'm sure there are circumstances like that. I don't know how often that happens, but it happens sometimes. And if you say that can't happen, that's not allowed if you're a sex worker, it just doesn't seem fair.
Well, I mean, but clearly, presumably such a case would go before a court, and the court would say, well, okay, that sounds like he's not a pimp then, right?
Yeah, I don't know of. I'm assuming like sex workers did not feel like this was fair, that they should have to go through that their boyfriend should be arrested in the first place. And I mean, if you're saying it's living off the avails, and that's how it usually is defined, is the crime, not whether or not they're abusive, then whether or not the boyfriend is abusive, they end up going to jail. But could we frame a law so that it's only about the abuse? I suppose, but then you have the problem that you have with abused women in any, like, non-sex workers who are abused women, which is they're reluctant to to acknowledge that they're being abused by abusive boyfriends if they feel emotionally entangled with that person.
Yeah, I mean, that is a good point. I mean, so yeah,
I don't
so if we
know. I don't know that there's a solution to this. Or we as a society have been debating this for a while, and it's an ongoing debate because there isn't an easy solution. And I wish there was one. It's horrible, the circumstances that so many of these women are in with these guys.
Yeah, I agree that there isn't an easy solution. I appreciate you acknowledging that, Chester. I will say, it seems to me that in a lot of these situations, there's kind of a balance between what makes sex workers' lives easier, or what makes particularly the good situations. You don't want to, necessarily stamp out the positive situations or the situations where a woman is acting from agency or from a place of fully made choice. And on the other hand, there's these societal effects of this, and what happens when you let some of these things into the law that can potentially have these create these negative feedback loops. I will say that when I'm thinking about pimping, I think that discussion you guys had about the individual, the boyfriend type pimp is very valuable. I think another element of it is the brothel type pimp. I think when you look at some of these places like Germany and Amsterdam, and I'm not too sure about the situation in New Zealand. I know it's a much smaller country, so it's a little bit hard to compare. But I know when you look at somewhere like Germany, some of the pimps are no longer boyfriends. They're owners of these large nightclubs where hundreds of women work. And that's where I see a lot of, that's where what I see is particularly pernicious, and where I start to kind of worry about the effects on society.
Yeah, I'm not sure of the case of the situation in Germany, but isn't it that is, if you want to work as a sex worker, you pretty much have to work in one of those brothels. You don't have other options. I'm not sure, but I don't.
Yeah, I'm not totally sure either, but I do know that the regulation makes it so that it can be. There's some situations that are challenging. I know in Amsterdam, there's only certain parts of the country where they allow street prostitution. It is pretty regulated in those countries.
Yeah,
I think there are options outside those brothels, but they're for whatever reason undesirable for many women. I think the brothels tend to be safer.
I would say in general, brothels probably are safer. That doesn't necessarily mean, there is the question of how dangerous it is in non-brothel situations. Denise was not working in a brothel. She was working out of an apartment without. A lot of sex workers will work together cooperatively in just a two sex workers working cooperatively out of one apartment kind of situation. But that's not how Denise was working. She was just working herself out of an apartment, and she never had she never experienced violence in the 2 or 3 years that she worked as an escort. Now, she also will admit she was lucky, but she's not the only one. There are other sex workers who say they've had either no experiences with violence, or their experiences with violence are low. Now, they're usually ones who are working indoors out of apartments, not on the street. I understand that street sex workers, their violence rates are usually higher. But yeah, I don't know that it is that violent when you're at the higher level, or at the higher earning level anyway, or when you're working indoors.
So you support full decriminalization.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And is the basic idea that from first principles that it's just should be people's right to do this, or is it more consequentialist? You think it'll produce the best outcome?
Well, I think both.
Okay. I do want to move on to one more topic before moving on to
Are we
a
still
radically
on?
different topic. Yeah. We're still on prostitution. I mean,
Yeah, it's a big topic.
Yeah, so the last thing I wanted to bring up in the context of kind of like the prostitution legalization question is what are your thoughts on sex trafficking?
Well, the definition has changed in the time since I began paying for sex. I mean, actually, when I began paying for sex in the late 90s, there was no public discussion of sex trafficking. It wasn't a thing. If someone had said to me, "What do you think of sex trafficking?" I would have been, or human trafficking, I would have said, "What do you mean?" Like I wouldn't have known the phrase. It only began to be used widely in relation to sex work or those phrases only began to be used widely in relation to sex work in around 2003, 2004. And at that point, it was about migration, moving people over borders. And that's what it was all about. And then the term caught on, and it began to be applied more widely to other forms of sex work and other forms of sex work that were seen negatively. And so now, so when you say sex trafficking, I mean, what are you referring to specifically?
I'm talking about slavery. Like women, there's a lot of evidence that, when a lot of women in prostitution are slaves in a pretty literal sense, like their passport is taken away, they're being held against their will, they're trapped somehow in the situation that they're in.
Yeah, I don't think I'm not saying that never happens, but the stories for that, the number of stories where that happens, it seems to me, from what I can tell, it's very low. Like actual slavery, where the woman can't get away. And I mean, the thing about sex work is that you are in constant contact with people outside of your situation. Like if you are being held by someone, you have escape opportunities all the time. There was this case, I think it was last year, this young woman named Victoria Morrison, a Canadian woman. She got involved with this guy. It began a romantic relationship with him, and at a certain point, it turned violent, and he did end up essentially kidnapping her and holding her against her will, and forcing her to have sex with clients, to do sex work, and with him being the beneficiary of the money, her having to turn over the money for him. I mean, it is, and it was a horrible case. He was horribly abusive. He would do things like he would lock her in a freezer until she would pass out, and the guy was just a monster. But she was able to get away because he had beaten her, and so she wasn't able to work for a day or two. And so she said to the guy who was holding her captive, can I want some cigarettes. Can I call this client of mine to bring over the cigarettes? And so the guy said, okay. So she called this guy, and the client came over, and she went out to get the cigarettes. And usually the guy who was holding her captive did not let her out, but in this circumstance, I guess he was willing to for whatever reason. And so she got in the car with the client, and she said, drive to the police station. And that's how she got away. But that's the thing. Like, compare that to like the Ariel Castro case. The guy, what U.S. city did that happen in? Do you know the case I'm talking about, where the guy was holding 3 women captive in a house for many years, and they were basically his sex slaves?
I think I did hear about that.
Yeah, and they eventually managed to get away, but after many, many years of being with that guy, and but he wasn't holding them as sex slaves. He wasn't advertising them and letting clients come and have sex with them. They were just captives. They were just his slaves in his house, and he was the only one they saw. And he was able to get away with that because they had no contact with the outside world. And that's the difference between that situation and the Victoria Morrison situation, where because she had contact with these clients, eventually she was able to get to one who was able to get her to safety. So she was in that situation for a matter of months, I think 3 months before she was able to escape, whereas the women held by Ariel Castro, it was like, I think like a decade or maybe more, maybe less. It was 3 women. Maybe one of them was less than 10 years. But anyways, they were there for years and years. And that's the thing. When in these genuine cases, and they do happen, like the Victoria Morrison one was a genuine case. When they do happen, they have avenues to escape, and that's why these stories are rare. The media stories about the Victoria Morrison case, they had interviews with police officers, and these police officers were saying things like, yeah, it's like something out of a Hollywood movie. Yeah, we never see stuff like this. Like, it's really rare that we see situations like this. And that's the truth. These situations are rare. Pimps can't get away with that sort of thing because it's relatively easy for the women to get away. Eventually, they find, a sympathetic John who's willing to help them. And that's not the only. I've read other cases like that where the women get away through the help of clients.
Yeah, those are some terrible cases, and I think you're right. In a lot of cases like that, hopefully the woman would have some way to get away. The study I was looking at in preparation for this, according to its UNHCR numbers from 2006, up to 4 million people are estimated to be exploited by human traffickers every year, and between 68 and 87% of those is for sexual purposes, sexual exploitation. I mean, I think a more typical case of what you would often see is, I think a more typical case is something like the pimp goes to the Ukraine and meets a girl and maybe they're dating, maybe they're not. Maybe he tells her he's an agent and he's like, you're so beautiful. You could be a model back in Germany. I have a job for you. Come with me. And she goes with him and he has her passport. When they get back to Germany, he's like, okay, your modeling job is basically like being a prostitute in this giant nightclub. And I have your passport and you need to pay back the debt that you incurred for travel costs and coming here. And there's really high interest. And she's in that situation.
Yeah. Maybe. I don't know the situation in Germany. But I mean, there are situations like that. I read about this other case. I know about it because a graphic novel was done about it, about this woman from South Korea who got into developed credit card debts, and to get out of the debts, she accepted a job, or she got involved with these traffickers who brought her over to America, and they were supposed to set her up in a job over here. And basically, the job turned out to be working in a strip club and doing initially a strip club and then in a massage parlor, which is essentially a brothel. And so she was very unhappy about this, but she was able eventually to earn the money and get out of it. But it seemed from reading the news stories about this, like she was unhappy about doing the work. She did not like it, and she did feel that she had been deceived. But the women around her did not seem to have been deceived. Like they seemed to know that they were getting into sex work when they left Korea. So how many of the situations are like her situation where she was deceived, and how many know what they're getting into? I think it's both, but both get lumped together as trafficking. So the situations, I mean, I'm not going to say like that woman's story. I'm sure again it's real that she was tricked into a situation, but like I don't think the numbers are that high. Like I said, the women around her did seem to understand their situation.
I mean, maybe it's hard to say if some of the women are completely complicit in the trafficking and totally consenting to it. It definitely seems like there's a lot of there's a lot of slavery happening with that trafficking, and this is one of my main reasons why I'm sympathetic to the Nordic model, is reading this study and learning that in places where it's legalized, trafficking goes way up.
I just don't believe it. I don't doubt that there are situations like this, and where a guy like genuinely does deceive someone or is genuinely abusive. Of course, they should be punished. Like the justice system should be, handling this situation like they would handle the situation of anyone who's abusive. Like any sort of violence should be treated by the criminal justice system. But I just don't think it's that as pervasive as a lot of people say it is.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, just like speaking from an emotional level for a moment, like doesn't it like disturb you though that like some of these women that you're procuring from like might be trafficked or be coming from these situations of such intense misery that like they're basically groomed into this? Like does that disturb you? Like it
Well, maybe I'm believing what I want to believe, but I accept that the numbers are low, and that the chances that any of the women I was with, the chances that they were trafficked is, again, low. If they were in a situation like that, I hope they got out of it, and the person who put them in that situation, I hope that person faces some kind of negative consequences for that. But I don't know, like, I don't think, well, when you're with another person, you should be treating them as well as you can in that situation, and with as much consideration as you can in this situation. And I tried to do that with all of the sex workers I saw, and I didn't get the impression that any of them, obviously some of the women I was with that I paid were not happy about being in that situation. most of them seemed okay, seemed fine, seemed normal. But yeah, there were women who were obviously not happy to be there. One or two, I'm thinking off the top of my head. But yeah, I mean, I'm remembering the ones for it's the stories in paying for it. The one circumstances coming to mind right away, where I knew that, or where it certainly seemed like the woman was not happy to be with me, and I deliberately came as quickly as I could, so that she wasn't having to endure sex with me longer than necessary. And I suppose if I was really a considerate person, I would have either not began having sex with her to begin with, or as soon as I realized, she doesn't like this, just pulled out without waiting to come. That would have been even more considerate. But I guess that's and maybe that's not enough. I don't know. Yeah, it doesn't sound pretty when I say it.
Yeah, I mean,
but that wasn't the majority of the sex workers I saw, and I don't know. Making it illegal because there are, I should actually go back to the subject of that one sex worker I was talking about. I really don't think she was trafficked, even though she obviously didn't like the work, because the place that I saw her at was a brothel where I saw several other sex workers, and I definitely got the impression that those sex workers were fine with the work, were there of their own choice. So it's difficult for me to conceive that it could have been a brothel situation where they were trafficking some women and not trafficking others. That just seems unlikely. Either it's all trafficked women or it's not.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I appreciate your honesty a lot, Chester. I know this is a tough conversation, and I know it's an area that's very personal to you. But
well, thank you. Yeah, I am trying to engage with this honestly, and yeah, not all of it makes me necessarily look good.
I guess that's a big part of being an artist, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you're dealing with real stuff, it's not all going to be comfortable or easy.
right.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
I was just going to ask if we should move on to prostitution in the Bible.
yeah.
We're kind of coming up on, we have maybe like 35 minutes left. So
let's do that. Yeah. I really want to talk about that book.
Good. Yahoo! I don't get to talk about this book as much as I'd like to. And, the way, at least for me, I like my books in reverse order. Like Mary Wept Over the Feet of Jesus is my favorite book. Paying for It is my second favorite, and etc. With my least favorite being the first book I published. So.
Well, I guess that's great that you're improving every time.
I'd like to think so.
Is that I Never Liked You is your least favorite, or the
Happy Clown?
The Happy Clown.
The Happy Clown is my least favorite. I Never Liked You. I still like that book. To me, my four good books are I Never Liked You. Well, it's the ones you read. I Never Liked You, Louis Riel, Paying for It, and Mary Wept Over the Feet of Jesus.
Right. Yeah. And actually, I agree with you. I think I enjoyed Mary Wept the most out of all the ones that I read.
Good.
Yeah. It was pretty paradigm altering for me. Well, I guess, do you want to just give like a summary and a background of what that book's about?
Okay. I think that the Virgin Mary was not a virgin. I think she was a prostitute. And I think that Jesus was not like a lot of Christians think of Jesus as being, they recognize that, there was some kind of, Jesus had interactions with prostitutes in the New Testament, and but they think that his attitude towards prostitutes was one of like toleration and forgiveness, whereas I think that he saw prostitution as a good thing. Those are the basic points I'm trying to make in Mary Wept Over the Feet of Jesus. There are others too, but I guess that's kind of those are probably the most controversial points that I'm trying to get across in the book.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, so you basically make a case that since the Bible is this old document and has so many different sources and has been revised countless times, that basically that Jesus's message was originally that, well, prostitutes are sinners, but we shouldn't judge them, and then, as you said, yeah, like maybe, we have this big thing about Mary being a virgin, but is it likely that God impregnated Mary, or is it much more likely that maybe she was
in some sort of sexual behavior that would have seemed inappropriate at the time?
Right. Like maybe she had. So obviously Joseph, is thinking about divorcing her, and so because she's pregnant, like before they get married and before he's ever been with her. And so he's thinking, well, she obviously got knocked up by some other guy. So either she was selling sex, or she was cheating on him, basically.
Right. Yeah. Something. So my reasons for thinking that she was probably involved in prostitution come from the genealogy that's found in the Gospel of Matthew. For those listeners who maybe don't know the Bible that well, there are the Bible is a book made up of various smaller books, and so there are 4 sort of biographies about Jesus. These are the books where we get most of our information about Jesus from. And these are the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. And so the Gospel of Matthew, one of these biblical books, the Gospel of Matthew has a genealogy for Jesus. It shows his ancestry. And most of the names in this genealogy are male names. And that was typical for genealogies, for ancient genealogies. You've usually listed the males, the father to son descent in genealogies. It was rarer for women to be mentioned in genealogies. So the Matthew's genealogy has a lot of is mostly made up of names of males. So-and-so was the father of so-and-so, who is the father of so-and-so. And then I think it begins with Adam, or maybe it begins with Abraham. I'm not sure, but I should know that. I should have looked it up. I should know that right offhand if I'm arguing this. But anyways, and so it goes down, and eventually the last name in the genealogy is Jesus's name. This is it's to show Jesus's line of descent. One of the significant points being that the line goes through significant figures in Jewish history, but the big one being King David, because it was a big deal in Judaism the Messiah is supposed to come from David's line. So that's one of the big points in the genealogy. But another thing that's in the genealogy is that along with all these male names, there are 5 women mentioned in the genealogy, which is a strange thing. Why, in amongst all these other male names, why are there 5 female names? And the 5 names are Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and actually Bathsheba's name isn't mentioned, but she's mentioned as the wife of Uriah. So she's listed there, not under her name, but under her husband's name, Bathsheba. And the 5th final name is Mary, the mother of Jesus. Now, many years ago, I read a book by a biblical scholar named Jane Schaberg. Sorry, I'm really going into detail here. I'm not sure if you want me to go into this much detail, but anyway.
Oh, no worries. Yeah, keep going.
So I read a book by a biblical scholar named Jane Schaberg, and she wrote this book called The Illegitimacy of Jesus. And in it, she made the argument that she talked about this genealogy and the female names in it and what a puzzle it was and what a mystery. And so her argument was that the names were there to indicate that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was a rape victim, or maybe a victim of like seduction and abandonment, but probably rape. And so I read that, and I was like, oh, that makes sense. Like that, there must be some kind of explanation, and this makes as much sense as anything. And so I just accepted it at the time. And it's a really good book, and it was well argued and very persuasive. But then years later, it occurred to me that those 4 women, none of them are rape victims, and none of them are stories about women who've been seduced and abandoned. And there are rape victims in the Bible. So if you wanted to hint that this Mary story related to rape, like you could. There are other names you could use, but Matthew didn't use those names. He used the names of Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba, and Tamar, she wasn't raped. She was a prostitute, or at least she had sex for pay on at least one occasion. I think she had sex for pay on more than one occasion, but she was, the significant story about her is a story in which she is paid for sex. And Rahab was a prostitute. She definitely, there's no ambiguity there. She had sex for pay with multiple men. Like that was her profession. And Ruth was not a prostitute, but she basically seduced a man in order to. She had premarital sex with a man. And Bathsheba's story is a little more complicated. She is often seen as a temptress. Admittedly, in her case, it might be a situation of rape. Like this Bathsheba's story, I don't know if you guys have read the biblical version of Bathsheba, the story of Bathsheba and David, King David.
I'm familiar with it. I don't remember if
right.
I'm sure I've read it at some point, but how the story goes is familiar.
Yeah. The way it's told in the Bible, it's very ambiguous. It could be a story of rape, but it also could be a story of a temptress deliberately seducing a man. Now, and plus, the author of that story later tells a story of another woman who definitely was raped. And in that story, it's not ambiguous at all. So it's like, why is it not ambiguous there? And in the story of Bathsheba, it is ambiguous. But anyways, leaving that aside, how did Matthew see that story? And it's very difficult to imagine. At that time, King David was this exalted figure. He was wanted to trace the line of the Messiah through King David because he was believed to be this heroic, wonderful figure, highly respected. And at that point in Jewish history, for Matthew to have seen King David as a rapist, it seems really unlikely. It seems much more likely that he saw the story as being one of a temptress, tempting a man to get involved in an adulterous affair. So those are the four stories before Mary. The stories involve of the women who are listed in that genealogy. 2 prostitutes and a woman who has premarital sex, and another woman who has adulterous sex and is probably supposed to be seen as a temptress. And so if Jane Schaberg is right, and that we're supposed to see their stories as relating to the story of Jesus' mother, the fifth woman in the genealogy, then it seems likely to me that we're not supposed to see the story as being one about rape. We're supposed to see it as being one about prostitution and premarital sex. So, anyways, that's my argument, or that's the argument of part of the book, and that was one of my entry points for why I wanted. All of this occurred to me many years ago, and I wanted to do a graphic novel about it, but I didn't know how. And so finally I figured out how, I think. I mean, it depends on whether one thinks it's a good book or not, but I ended up doing it as a series of stories about various biblical figures, and obviously 5 of the biblical figures I do stories about in the book are Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and Mary.
Yeah, I mean, well, I definitely enjoyed it, so I think it works as a book.
I thought it was great. Yeah, I really enjoyed reading it, and I also found your argument compelling about Mary.
Oh, good.
Yeah, I just wanted to get into, you take it a little bit further in the notes, where you talk about, I assume that this book is near and dear to you because of the prostitution issue, and your efforts to decriminalize prostitution. So at the end of the book, in the notes, you talk about how the other gods that were not Yahweh were often supported by they had temples that were where prostitutes were working, and the temples were supported by the incomes of those prostitutes. I just thought that was so fascinating that Yahweh, the Jewish God, is very much against prostitution, and I was wondering what the reasons for that would be, and I was also wondering what the reasons why why we don't see temples run by prostitutes anymore, and maybe are you trying to say that like something that used to be around in Jesus's time, which was positive, kind of went away, and maybe it should come back in some way?
Well, I think the focus on a male god. I mean, this is certainly. I mean, it's a common idea today. Like the focus on a male god. I mean, I think, or at least the idea became popular many years ago, I think in the 70s, when an author named Merlin Stone wrote a book called, I think it was called When God Was a Woman. I read that book many years ago, but yeah, she argued that religion, goddess worship was once much more widespread, and that then there was sort of a war between a patriarchal religion or patriarchal religions and more female-centric religions, and the patriarchal religions, for whatever reason, probably not exclusively religious reasons. It's partly just men ended up winning the overall culture war against women. But the patriarchal religions ended up winning out, and the goddess religions, lost. Now there is, I think, well, this is something debated in the academic world. How much those goddess religions focused on prostitution. It seems obvious to me that at least some of them did. Some of them honored prostitution. I actually, after I finished Mary Wept Over the Feet of Jesus, I picked up a work called Inanna by, I think she's a Toronto author, Kim Eklund. It's a translation of the texts associated with the goddess Inanna, and sure enough, a lot of them relate to prostitution and what a wonderful thing prostitution is, and all this sort of stuff. I probably would have included some lines from that or quoted some lines from that in the notes section of Mary Wept if I'd read it in time. But yeah, like as I was saying, this is debated in academic circles. Like there are some academics who say, no, scholars are misinterpreting those texts. The prostitution wasn't widely honored in goddess religions. I could have gotten much more into that debate if I'd had the room, but the notes section at the back of the book was already pretty long, and my publisher wasn't happy about how long those notes were going on for, how many pages I was devoting to those notes. So
Yeah.
so I couldn't get into that debate as much as I might have wanted to. But yeah, obviously I think I don't think it's even a debate, at least within the Hebrew Bible texts. I think it's clear there was some amount of like the goddess religion that the Yahweh, the Yahwists were fighting against, were somehow associated with prostitution.
Well, so I think the Bible hints at why Yahweh may have been very against prostitution. The first one is that in the story of Rahab, I believe, she's living in Jericho, and basically she's the whole reason why Jericho gets taken over by the Israelites. And so maybe the Bible is trying to make a statement that, like, okay, well, maybe prostitutes are somehow, a security vulnerability or something like that to a society. I'm not sure. But the other point seems to be that there's this plague that's happening among the Israelites, and the plague is solved once all of the men who are connected with prostitutes are basically murdered. So maybe it's STDs or something like that. But I was kind of curious what your thoughts on that were.
Yeah, I've always wondered about, like, I've tried to look into the history of STDs and what would have been going on with them in biblical times, and there just doesn't seem to be information on that subject. I mean, you might be right. Biblical scholars make all sorts of speculations about those plagues that were going on in the. And what you're talking about is the Exodus, when Moses takes the Jewish people, rescues the Jewish slaves who are working in Egypt, and takes them out of Egypt, and they wander around the desert for 40 years. And in that time, there's a whole series of plagues and sicknesses and whatnot. But also the Jewish the people under Moses keep coming in contact with these people who live, I guess, around the desert, Moabites and various other people who are associated with prostitution. And so, yeah, maybe it's related to STDs, or maybe it's not. I mean, who knows what was going on there. But I mean, it's as good an idea as any. But the link isn't made explicitly clearly. But of course, at that time, they wouldn't maybe have understood quite why certain people, why certain illnesses were associated with sex. It's hard to say. But I'm not sure. Was that really the reason why the Yahweh, the Yahwists, the male god believers were against the female, the goddess? I don't think it could have been just that.
Interesting.
Yeah, I have heard the argument too that a lot of the texts were written during the Babylonian exile, when the Israelites were exiled in Babylon, and
right.
A lot of the parts of the Bible that were written there are very much like, these are our cultural practices. We must practice them. They're very extensive rules that we must follow, and we must not follow the ways of the other. And it was like an anti-assimilation kind of thing, like they were trying to stay together.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I did want to ask about, one thing I found most intriguing in Mary Wept Over the Feet of Jesus is this idea of you make an argument kind of that the Bible, there's parts of the Bible that are very much have the message of it's important to follow the rules and be obedient to God, but there's other parts of the Bible that more have the message of God favors those who break the rules and go off by themselves. Do you want to maybe speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, it's usually thought that the Hebrew Bible, what's commonly, or at least in the Christian world, what's known as the Old Testament, the pre-Christian stuff, that's all about the laws of Moses, and about obeying those laws. And I mean, that's true to a certain extent. The laws of Moses are a big deal. And it's clear that a lot of the biblical writers, are into those laws and think they should be obeyed, and are arguing for obeying them. But the Bible was written by many people making many sorts of arguments, and they weren't all necessarily agreeing on every point. And it seems, it seems to me, and this isn't my original thought, that some of the writers of the Bible were arguing that God favors those who disobey Him, who make their own path, and sort of challenge God, challenge His rules. And yeah, this argument is not, as I said, it's not original to me. I was introduced. I read a book. Wait a second. What was it called? I remember the author's name, Yoram Hazony. I think his book was called The Philosophy of the Hebrew Scriptures, but no, okay, I've got it in front of me now. The Philosophy of Hebrew Scripture by Yoram Hazony, which it's a pretty recent book. It came out in 2012, so it's probably still in print. So yeah, he was making that argument that that in places, at least in places, actually he was making the argument that the whole of the Hebrew Bible could be read this way: that God, favors those who challenge him and don't necessarily hew to the to every line of the law. So I found that an interesting perspective, and it made a certain amount of sense to me, and so yeah, I incorporated that into the book too.
Yeah, you do mention several stories throughout the Bible where basically rule breakers are rewarded when you would expect them to be punished.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was super interesting to me. I guess one thing I was sort of wondering is like, it seems like, I don't know, like, is there a particular way, do you think, that like God favors rule breakers, or like, is it rule breakers for like innovating, or just like rule breakers in general?
It's probably not rule breakers in general. I think the idea is that God recognizes that laws are limited, and that if you can break a rule and improve your life and the lives of those around you, and it results in something that's good, then that's good. And that the laws are there for general guidance, but you should be able to, like, that God wants us to innovate and not just be rule followers.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Are you familiar with Ken Wilber?
Yes. I tried to read. Is it A Brief History of Everything? Is that one of his books?
Yeah. I read that one. Yeah.
Yeah, I got maybe a quarter of the way into that one. I've read I've read other writers who are influenced by him, and I like their writings better than I like his. It's not. His ideas sound like they're very interesting, but I'm not that big a fan of his writing style, I guess, or at least I find it difficult to get through. But
yeah, it can be a little dense.
Yeah, I reference a fellow in Mary Wept Over the Feet of Jesus. I reference a writer named Jim Marion who defines himself as a Christian mystic. And he was quite influenced by Wilber and references Wilber a whole lot in his main book, which is called Putting on the Mind of Christ. So that's a really good book. And so I guess I'm more familiar with Wilber kind of secondhand through writers like that.
Yeah, you also cited a book called Integral Christianity, or I'm not sure if you cited it or just recommended it as a good read,
Yes, and he is also influenced by Wilber. That's true. The author of that book.
Yeah, I was struck by your characterization of Jesus as this spiritually advanced human who experienced non-dual states or something like that, which in Wilber's framework is this advanced stage of human development, basically. And so, yeah, I was struck by the similarities between what you wrote there and Wilber.
Yeah, I think, well, maybe I'm an idealist, but I definitely think there are spiritually enlightened people around, and there must have been throughout human history. And so I'm completely willing to believe that Jesus was one of them. But so yeah. I think that's the best interpretation of what was going on there. Like, I don't believe. I tend to dismiss ideas that Jesus was, divine, or if he was divine, he was divine in a way that we all could be divine. I guess I would say.
Yeah. Wilbur definitely agrees with you on that point as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess the similarity that struck me between your work and Wilbur is he tends to define the evolution of consciousness in stages. So he would distinguish between a state that's like pre-rules, like a child that's never been socialized, or a lawless society, and then a society that has rules, and then a society that transcends the rules. So the idea is that maybe having rules is a necessary stage of development, but at some point you do want to move beyond them.
Yeah, that makes sense. And now that you're saying it, that does. That's what Jim Marion was talking about in Putting on the Mind of Christ, and he was totally crediting Wilbur. He was not. He's not trying to say those ideas were original to him.
Like, how would you say, like, how would one go about like building a moral system in this sort of like post-rules kind of paradigm?
Well, I would say I would base it. I would approach it the way Jesus did. That it's all about love. It's about loving God, and I interpret that as loving life. But I guess different religious people would interpret that different ways. And it's about loving those around you, loving your neighbors. When Jesus, and of course, when Jesus talks about that, he is actually quoting the Hebrew Bible. Those lines are actually from the Hebrew Bible, from the Torah, I think. Jesus obviously puts special emphasis on those aspects of the Torah in a way that Jewish people usually don't. Usually Jews put more emphasis on the law and following the law, and Jesus was putting special emphasis instead on love. I would say if you're trying to be as loving to those around you as you can be, then maybe you'll go wrong to some degree, but you're more likely on the right track than if you're letting what one might call the negative emotions, anger, hatred, jealousy, if you're letting those emotions dominate you. And so, trying to focus as much on being loving and approaching your relationships in a loving way. That seems to me to be important to leading a spiritual life, and I guess what one would call a moral life.
I was just going to say, I think that sounds pretty good. It's definitely, it's something that's easy to agree with. Is it something to build, as Ariel said, a moral system or a society on? Maybe. I think what the Bible was saying with all of these sort of contradictions is that, as Ariel was saying, maybe you need the rules for people who are in the earlier stages of development, and then people who kind of outgrow the rules because they have wisdom can be allowed to break the rules if their actions are loving or leading to some good consequence.
Yeah, I'm not sure that Jesus was trying to speak to how one should build societies. I think he was trying to speak to the individual, and really, spirituality, I think it is about the individual experience. And, I'm a big believer in the separation of church and state. So I'm not sure that, like, these to me, these are guides. And a big part of the problem about the way that Christianity developed is that Christians tried to make general rules that everyone should follow. That is because we can see that the Good Samaritan did the right thing, therefore we should force everyone to be like the Good Samaritan, which is, Jesus would have thought that, I think Jesus would have disagreed with that. The Good Samaritan was good because the goodness came out of the depths of his soul. Forcing the Good Samaritan to do good things, or forcing a person to act like the Good Samaritan, is the opposite of what Jesus wanted. He didn't want people to be forced to do good. He wanted them to be good.
Right. So it's back kind of the obedience-based paradigm again.
Yeah, but Christianity, it's like it made the mistake of going back to like a rules way of thinking. Like we must force everyone to be like the Good Samaritan. There are rules, and it's the rules that the rule of the Good Samaritan. We must be we must follow that rule, which is that's not the right way of thinking. Or I'm pretty sure Jesus would have disagreed with that.
Yeah, I mean the tricky thing about saying it's okay to break rules if you X, Y, and Z, the tricky thing is that, well, then everybody is going to be thinking, oh, well, obviously the rules don't apply to me because this is a special situation. And so it's kind of like, you need to really, really, really impress on people the importance of the rules. And if they're breaking the rules, they need to have a really, really, really special reason.
Yeah, I suppose that makes sense. The rules are out there.
I guess if someone was truly in a state of love, though, maybe it wouldn't be that important that they follow the rules.
Yeah, I think the more love-focused you are, the less you worry about the rules.
Yeah.
I guess one question I would have is if everybody is following love and the rules are, kind of wobbly or shaky, or they don't really exist much, would that be a good society?
A society in which everyone was doing their best to be loving to everyone around them? I think that's likely to be a pretty good society. I don't know that it would be perfect or that conflicts would never arise. But obviously, if there was a society like that, we're talking about one where people are more evolved than they are now. So I mean, it's and I think that's part of the message, or part of the Christian message, if we interpret it correctly, is focusing on love and the transformative power of it.
Yeah, and I think we do almost see something like that in our society today. Like, it seems to me like we do see like a falling away of a lot of like rules and mores that were common in the past, and we do almost treat rules as suggestions, like the laws as suggestions often, or instead of hard and fast moral strictures. And at the same time, people are coming together in different ways. Like, it seems like people are like treating each other with more empathy, even across in groups. Like, it does seem like things are moving in that direction.
Yeah, although to a certain extent, that's because in modern industrialized countries, our laws have become so complex that no one can know all the laws. We can't know all the rules. So to a certain extent, we're almost encouraged to treat them more as suggestions or something we can't really know. I mean, there's a law, a Canadian law still on the books, that it's illegal to put out a crime comic book. And I mean, so many of these laws are ridiculous. But I mean, a lot of my books paying for it could be considered a book that celebrates crime. I'm certainly committing all sorts of crimes in that. I'm committing one specific crime over and over again.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, would you consider it an act of civil disobedience?
Well, I mean, that's not what I was thinking when I began paying for sex. I wasn't thinking I'm making I'm doing a political act here. I guess the political act is more recording it and putting it out as putting out my experiences as a book. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I do want to ask, like, if we're talking about like a love-based moral system, how do you, like, what is love? We talked about love a little bit as an emotion, but I'm interested to get a little bit more nuanced about what love actually is.
Boy, it's feeling a very positive emotion about someone. It's wanting to take their perspective into account. It's trying to do the best for them that you can. It's not trying to act out of selfish motives when you're interacting with that person. But yeah, I'm not, and I'm sure that definition is still falling short of exactly what love is.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean,
how would you guys define it?
Yeah, I was going to say that seems like a good jumping off point at least.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I read something recently about like the dark triad, like the big three of like narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism.
No, I Machiavelli. What was the big? What were they again?
Oh, it's like in personality theory, there's this idea that like there's a dark triad of characteristics, and when people have all three, it's like really bad.
Uh-huh.
And the three are psychopathy, so not having empathy for others.
Okay.
Narcissism, which is basically making one's life all about oneself and one's ego.
Mm-hmm.
And Machiavellianism, which is basically being super manipulative.
Right. Oh.
And so it seems to me, so I read this article that basically was saying that the opposite of that is something like recognizing the full humanity of everyone around you all the time as much as possible. And that seemed to me to be a pretty good definition of love.
Yeah. It certainly seems to me like a healthy way of approaching life and those around you.
I guess I would also distinguish love from like falling in love. I think that might be a different.
Oh yeah. Oh, definitely.
Kind of experience.
Yeah. That's one of the tricky things about the word love is, so often it is confused with romantic love, and when I talk about love in general, I'm not usually talking about romantic love.
Right.
There are connections between them, obviously.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Like, it does seem like falling in love with somebody is just a really, really extreme version of love, where you really want the best for them, and you want to be with them all the time, and you feel very strong emotions,
right.
some of which can be very positive, or some of which can be very negative.
Yeah, but with romantic love, like, I think probably the distinguishing feature is the sexual part of it, like, feeling strongly sexually attracted to someone, in addition to feeling those loving feelings for them.
Yeah, that is controversial, but I would agree that that's maybe a necessary element. Yeah.
I just wanted to give my response to the what is love question. Chester, in one of your books, it might have been Mary Wept, you talk about, what's the fundamental stuff of the universe? Is it consciousness or is it matter? Did consciousness give rise to matter, or did matter give rise to consciousness? And you define being religious as believing that consciousness was first and then matter came out of consciousness, which I tend to kind of agree with. I think maybe they're just the same thing. Maybe it's like matter and energy. You can kind of use E equals MC squared or something like that to transfer in between them or something. I don't know. But something at the beginning of the universe was this like pure consciousness, which gave rise to everything. And it seems to me, when I think about it, when I think about love, like very deeply, that like that love is kind of that. It's kind of like it goes beyond just being a human and seeing the humanity in everybody. I would call them almost like seeing the divinity in everyone and everything. Like seeing that creative spark that gives rise to everything. Anyway, that's my attempt at an answer to the question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that whole matter of, I mean, you mentioned me referencing the religious perspective and seeing matter, whether or not matter develops out of consciousness or whether consciousness develops out of matter, with the first one being the religious view and the second one being the scientific materialist view. And since then I have encountered a few writers who seem to approach that in different ways. I'm trying to think. Oh, yeah. There's this guy, Timothy Freak, who, and that last name is spelled Freke. He's got this interesting perspective. He seems to be a materialist, but he believes that we're becoming, in developing consciousness, we're becoming more and more God-like, and so that he sees God as the goal of evolution, and so he kind of reverses it. He's a materialist, but he also has a religious perspective in that he thinks eventually we will all develop into this one God-like figure, and that, if I remember his argument correctly, he believes that God-like figure at the end of history is actually controlling backwards over time to ensure that he exists. And I've heard that argument made elsewhere. I think there's a book called The Physics of Immortality by the guy's last name was Tipler. I think that was his argument too.
Yeah, I've actually definitely heard variations of that argument myself. There's a short story by Isaac Asimov called The Last Question, where he talks about how, but I don't know if I want to give it away, but something similar to that, where there's a God at the end of history and humanity kind of develops into it, and then creates the next universe. But yeah, I don't know if that's exactly the same thing as, actually Wilbur talks about what you were saying as where God, he actually talks about how there are two different conceptions of God. One is, as you said, kind of at the end of history, being this attractor. It kind of, as you said, works backwards through time and to ensure that he exists. And then there's the other God, which is working forwards through time from, the primordial beginnings of the universe. Mm. And so there's kind of two different gods which are working in opposite directions. And then, once you reach a high enough spiritual level of development, then you see that actually it's all the same God and it's all the same stuff. So, something like that.
I am the Alpha and the Omega.
Right. Perfect.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. He did say that. Jesus said that, not Wilbur.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does seem to me that it seems so unlikely that we are the highest point of development for consciousness. Like, it seems to me that there must be a higher level beyond us.
Definitely.
Yeah. Whether that means alien consciousnesses, is that correct? Anyways, whatever. Or divine beings, or one ultimate divine being. But there's got to be something over us.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that.
Yeah, this is super interesting. I think I like this definition of love. It speaks to also like there's something creative and transformative about love, and it's almost like you guys are just taking that to like the ultimate extreme.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, well, so somewhere in the Bible, I think it might have been Jesus or it might have been St. Paul or something like that. They say God is love. And so if you define God as we defined him before, this kind of like conscious substrate of everything, and you could just see love as that which creates everything else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Paul does have there are a few good lines in Paul about the importance of love. Those are the best parts of Paul. For the most part, I'm not a big fan of Paul's writings.
Me neither.
Yeah, he says some cool stuff occasionally.
Yeah, I was reading something about one of the early church fathers, and he was writing about Paul, and he's like, I do not understand Paul at all. Like, the guy seems completely unintelligible. And it's like, oh wow, they were admitting that so early on in Christianity.
Wait, when was this?
One of the early Christian fathers, like probably around the year, I don't know, like 200 or 300.
Oh, and they were saying Paul who had existed maybe just a few decades earlier. Like, what was he talking about?
Right.
Yeah,
it would have been a bit more than a few decades, but yeah.
Oh, sure. I guess he was kind of immediately after Jesus.
Yeah, I think he's supposed to have been writing his works around the years 50 to maybe around 60, something, or around that area.
Right.
Paul's responsible for the whole virgin birth, Son of God.
Oh, actually, no. Paul is not responsible for the virgin birth. But Paul never mentions the virgin birth. He doesn't reference, which is one of the problems with the virgin birth, is Paul does not seem to know about that idea at all.
Interesting. Very interesting.
Fascinating.
The idea that Jesus is the Son of God in a literal way comes from Paul, right?
That's the thing about Paul. Trying to pin down exactly what he's saying, it's difficult. He clearly thinks that Jesus is very significant. There's something supernatural about him. He was able to survive death and go on in some sort of spiritual way, but pinning him down as far as exactly his relationship to God, like, that's like, yeah, but it's never precisely clear in Paul. Like, Paul is obsessed with Jesus's with the resurrection, with Jesus somehow surviving death. That's Paul's big thing. Well, that and condemning prostitution. Those are Paul's two big things.
Yeah. And another thing I've heard that Paul did is he was really adamant about like separating Christianity from Judaism. The idea before that, the boundary between the two is much more blurred.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, obviously, they at a certain point they were the same religion, and and then they developed along separate lines. And Paul was a significant figure in that. He apparently, I mean, there's a little bit of a debate about this, but he claimed to be Jewish. He said he was a Pharisee. Apparently he was trying to develop followers outside of Judaism. He was trying to appeal to the Gentiles, and I guess he was to some degree successful. But that's one of the things that got Christianity developing in a separate way. Was he was saying, Jewish Christians, okay, it's fine for you guys to follow the Torah, to follow the law, but Gentiles should be following it. It's okay if they don't follow all of the rules of the Torah, and it's okay if they don't get circumcised. He was certainly one of the important figures in distinguishing Christianity from Judaism.
Right. Okay.
You
I wanted to ask a really quick question.
Okay.
This is totally unrelated, but I was just really curious about it. I read that you switched from something like anarcho-communism to anarcho-capitalism around when you were writing Louis Riel. I was wondering, like, what caused that conversion? Was it just being a John and just basically seeing how regulations can be harmful? Or was it maybe like reading some kind of philosophy?
Well, at the time, I wouldn't have defined myself as an anarcho-communist. I had become convinced that anarchism made sense to me, but I was reading a lot of books about anarchism, and I was struggling. Like I read, that famous I can't remember who said it, but that famous line, "Property is theft." Do you guys remember who said that?
Oh,
not sure.
Oh boy, that might have been like Rothbard or sorry, property is theft. Oh yeah, it must have been.
Must have been a leftist. Oh,
yeah, Proudhon or something.
Yeah,
probably him or somebody related to him. Yeah.
Anyway, I was struggling.
I thought you said
with that.
Taxation is theft.
No. Yeah, I was struggling with that. I wasn't sure if that made sense or not, and then I read. But anyways, when I started Louis Riel, I was defining myself as an anarchist, even if I still was kind of like fuzzy on the details, specifically regarding property rights. But one of the reasons for wanting to do the Riel book was because it was a story in which the government was bad, and I could make governmental figures the bad guys, and and people fighting against the government the good guys. Even though I was completely aware that Riel wouldn't have defined himself as an anarchist. But that was my thinking. And then while I was working on the Riel book, I guess I was in a bookstore and I came across this book called, the title is The Novelist Triumph, Property and Prosperity Through the Ages by a writer named Tom Bethel. And I was familiar with Bethel's name. He had written an article about, to jump to a completely unrelated subject, he had written an article about he had been involved in a debate. It was an article in the Atlantic, or it was two articles in the Atlantic. They had presented two sides of the Shakespeare authorship question. And so there was one writer who was arguing that Shakespeare's works were written by Shakespeare, and there was another writer who was arguing that Shakespeare's works were not written by Shakespeare. And I already had my ideas about this. I already rejected, I don't think Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare's works. To make myself sound like a kook, although I probably sound like a kook anyways for all sorts of other reasons. But so in this pair of Atlantic essays, Tom Bethel had written the article that was arguing that Shakespeare did not write Shakespeare's works. So I was like, oh, Tom Bethel, he's one of the good guys. So when I saw he'd written this book about property rights, I was like, oh, it's the guy who thinks Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare's works. He's an interesting guy. And here's a book about property rights. And, the Riel story, one of the significant issues is property rights. So maybe I should pick up a book that's more about, general property rights theory. So I read Bethel's book, and he won me over to the position that property rights were important. And at the time, I still was not, as well read on the subject of anarchism as maybe I should have been. I thought, if you believe that property rights are necessary, then you must believe that government to some degree is necessary. And so I thought, I guess that makes me a libertarian, which I was really struggling with because I thought of libertarians as assholes. Those guys are such jerks. But I was like, yeah, but I have these anarchistic inclinations. I really do think government's bad. But on the other hand, property rights do seem important. It does seem like property rights regimes do bring greater wealth and all this sort of stuff. So I guess I'm a libertarian. And at the time, I wasn't aware that there was such a thing as anarcho-capitalism. So for several years, I defined myself as a libertarian. And of course, I can now see that I was that I was more a minarchist. Once I found out that there was such a thing as you could still call yourself an anarchist, and it was a case could be made that the state is not necessary, but that property rights could be still respected and do their good work. So I ended up finally in the anarcho-capitalist camp.
Cool. Thanks for that story.
In maybe an overly long and unnecessarily long way.
No,
that's fine.
Very interesting. And you finished Louis Riel according to your original kind of conception, right?
Yeah, I was tempted to put in some scene where Riel was advocating for property rights or something, but I attempted writing some scenes like that, and it just didn't seem to be working. And I just ended up following the script as I originally wrote it, without all the property rights stuff.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, we could have another few-hour conversation about that, but
yeah, no doubt. Yeah, we're at time. I think we're all getting a little tired.
Yeah, no, I'm enjoying this, but I think we should definitely wrap it up.
No, I'll walk us out. Thank you so much, Chester. This was really cool.
Well, thank you, Ariel and Chris. I enjoyed it. It was a fun. Even though you were challenging me, that was good. I should be challenged on stuff I'm sure on lots of issues, but no, I enjoyed the conversation.
Cool.
Yeah, well, we definitely did too, and I'm just, it's so cool to have you on here, and it's great that we all stayed respectful, and I think the audience is going to love this one.
Good.
Agreed.
Thanks for joining us on the Multiversity Project. We hope you found this episode both mind-bending and enjoyable.
We can be found all over the social media space and at multiversityproject.co.
If you like this content, give us a like, comment, follow, share, or support us on Patreon.
Catch you on the flip side.